You're going today, here at Colin Turbett, published by fellow radical bookshop, Calton Books. Book provides impactful acceptance to the violence and leading the way. Right to love we'll be talking to Colin.
Thanks very much, Tricia. Thanks very much all for coming along. I'm kind of assuming that you're a left audience. I don't want you to come into a radical bookshop to celebrate a notorious fascist victory 50 years ago. But next month is a very, very important anniversary. It's the 50th anniversary of the fascist coup, when the junta, led eventually by Pinochet, took power in Chile and did absolutely unimaginable atrocities on the left of socialists and trade unionists in order to get Chile back on a firmly capitalist road, in tune with the wishes of the Western countries in the West, like the US and the UK, who had done everything they could to undermine Allende's government, both before and after it was elected in 1970. Now, I want you to imagine for a minute that if you're on the left, you're from the UK, if you're voters here, you'll know that in the 2019 general election, we had a left-wing leader of the Labour Party, not, in my view, putting forward a particularly socialist programme, but certainly seen by the right and the establishment in the UK as being a bogeyman of the left, as a communist and a Marxist, and an extremely dangerous figure. Now, if you can imagine that Corbyn actually won, and then what would have come into play? You would have got a run on the pound, you would have got efforts, both overt and covert, to undermine and crash the economy in order to rubbish the new government. You'd have had every trick in the book played in order to undermine popular support for the government and to ensure that it was overthrown. Now, all that happened in Chile, but you add an extra dimension to that, which is disquiet beyond the normal reaches of the establishment, but into the military. You throw that into the mix, and then what happened in Chile was that there had been, although Chile's democracy, it's not like our own, but it had fairly stable traditions going back to the 19th century. But if there were attempts at military coups in Chile over the years, including during the Allende years, and they weren't successful because of popular mobilization to resist them. But the one in September 1973 succeeded. Now, think yourselves back to Britain in 2019, or Britain at the time of the Allende, the coup that overthrew him in 1973. And it's actually not so far removed. And I'm not talking wild conspiracies here. There were people in this country associated with the right and Pinochet's regime in Chile. People, notably Robert Moss and Brian Crozier, who were both leading lights for The Economist magazine. Moss led the think tank associated with it, and Crozier was his boss in The Economist. Now, these people they visited Chile, they talked up Chile. Crozier was involved in trying to undermine Allende and writing about that. Crozier, after the coup, wrote papers and articles justifying the use of torture against opponents of the new regime in Chile. So these weren't just, liberal bystanders. They were totally enmeshed in the coup and everything the coup stood for. Members of our establishment in the UK. Now they had links with people in the military, and in Crozier's biography, written many years later, his autobiography, he boasted that at that time he spoke to an audience of about 200 army officers who applauded him, gave him a 5-minute standing ovation when he suggested that the Wilson government of 1974 might have to be overthrown by the military. So that of course never happened. British democracy, being what it is, managed to kind of avoid that completely. And by the late 1970s, we had a government led by Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, who was a friend of Augusto Pinochet, the dictator of Chile. Thatcher actually employed in 1976 Robert Moss to be her speechwriter. And Brian Crozier was one of her political advisors at that time as well. So clear links between the Thatcher government and Pinochet. And in later years, Thatcher befriended Pinochet. They didn't know each other personally until the 1980s, 90s. But when they did meet, they became firm friends. And Thatcher, of course, fought against Pinochet's extradition back to Spain, in fact, initially, to face charges of murder because of his the orders that he'd issued quite directly in his time in the dictatorship. So the undermining of the regime, Allende's regime in Chile, did involve the British. It did involve, for instance, Britain had an agency at that time who put out literature, ostensibly neutral literature, and I've researched this in relation to stuff that they put out about the Soviet Union in the Cold War and stuff they promoted at that time. Very innocent looking literature like Animal Farm by George Orwell. But these books were promoted and other writings were promoted in order to steer people towards our side in the Cold War. And that was very much what it was all about at that time. So the coup that took place in September 73 was bloody and murderous. Within weeks, up to 10,000 people on the left and trade unionists had disappeared and been murdered. Others were being regularly arrested and placed into detention centres. One of the most notorious of these was the Santiago Stadium, the football stadium, where the national team played. And thousands of people from the Santiago area, the capital of Chile, were detained there and tortured and in some cases murdered. That included leading cultural figures like Victor Jara, the folk singer, who was known internationally at that time. Jara wasn't just killed. Before he was killed, he had his hands broken in order to, as a kind of symbolic gesture, because he played the guitar. He had his neck broken and he was shot 44 times. We know that because his partner, who was British, found his body in a pile of bodies in the stadium. And that was the state she found his body in, her partner and her husband. So they had no compunction about terror and the use of terror in order to subdue the population. Now, one of the people I spoke to when writing this book was a guy called Hernandez Canca, who was a Chilean who finished up in Scotland. And Hernando had been a very active supporter of the Popular Unity, Allende's popular government, which combined of various parties, including the socialists and communists. Hernando was a Socialist Party member. Allende's not just promise, but action in trying to transcend Chile from a capitalist, very, very unequal society to a socialist one, enthused young people like him. He volunteered, he was an electrical engineer, who lectured in the university in Santiago. He volunteered to go out weekends in his spare time to help build socialism out in the countryside and elsewhere. Worked for a month for free in a copper mine in the north of the country where he came from. Now, Hernando went underground at the time of the coup, as many people did. During the day, he was involved in his day job and claimed, to all appearances, had dropped politics and political activity entirely. At night, he was out with a very small group of comrades, because one of the things they learned was that the fewer people you knew, the safer you were. So the small cohort of comrades, he was out there sticking up posters with handbills and other quite imaginative forms of agit-prop in order to keep the resistance alive and convince people that it was worth keeping the idea, the flame of socialism alive, and that the dictatorship could be resisted. So after a year in September 74, and Fernando and his comrades were planning activity around the first anniversary of the coup. They realized they wouldn't be able to do it on the 11th of September because there'd be too many troops on the streets then. So they planned activity for a few days later. In the meantime, they were all lifted. And he and his 3 comrades that he was working with, who were all involved in the MIA, which was a kind of Cuban influenced far left organization, revolutionary organization, who were very active in Chile, particularly amongst the Mapuche Indians. They were all arrested. They were taken to a torture center called San Domingo, and there's some pictures circulating. You can see a picture that Fernando gave me of the torture center to which he was taken. And that officially didn't exist. Nobody knew about it officially. It looked like an innocent residence, but cars came and went during the night. That was the DINA set up by Pinochet in order to spread terror. And he and his comrades were tortured for days and days in front of one another. And they'd, of course, agreed beforehand that if anything like that should happen, you give away absolutely nothing. Because if you do, not only will you be murdered, but your comrades will die too. So they were tortured in front of each other, unimaginably. And then nothing was given away that could associate Fernando with the 3 mere comrades. And so he spent 3 weeks in the torture center. Most people didn't stay there longer than a couple of days before they disappeared and were never seen again, which is what happened to his 3 comrades. They're now on a list of people that disappeared during the years of the dictatorship. Fernando survived. He eventually finished up being recognized as a prisoner and regarded as prisoners of war, so they didn't have to stand trial, prisoners of an internal war. And a year later, because he was now identified as a political prisoner, his name was picked up by a solidarity group of 5 who started writing and lobbying on his behalf. And that happened on many, many times. So the regime decided to release him on their terms, and Hernando wanted to send him to Mexico. Hernando refused. He and his comrades decided that, although he'd still never admitted to Socialist Party membership or activism, never admitted that until after he was released, he was in Europe. But they decided they would refuse that. They wanted to continue to be active in Chile. They believed in the resistance being based in Chile. So he refused and eventually finished up being put on a plane to Nairobi in Africa, and from there to Amsterdam, and there to Britain. Couldn't speak a word of English, didn't know anything about the UK, and finished up through the refugee reception centre set up by a solidarity group, the Joint Committee for Refugees. He finished up in Glasgow and became part of the solidarity movement run by the Chile Solidarity Campaign. And his story isn't untypical. it wasn't just Chileans who were locked up and detained and tortured. Mike Gatehouse, who became the first General Secretary of the Chile Solidarity Committee that was set up soon after the coup, had been enthused by what was going on in Chile and had gone over there from Britain to work as a computer engineer and volunteer in socialist activity supporting the government. He was lifted, taken to the stadium. He saw people murdered and tortured. He lost friends there. But in a week, he was expelled, but thanks to intervention by the UK's embassy, and sent back to Britain, where he continued activity right through until the end of the regime. I told you about Victor Jara. Another notable case was that Sheila Casaby, who was a British doctor working in Chile. And in 1975, she was arrested because she had treated, doctors sign a Hippocratic oath, whereby they will treat anybody that requires it. And she had treated, or allegedly treated, somebody who was wanted by the DINA, a well-known MIA activist, one of the MIA leaders. And she was detained and tortured, had electric shocks applied to her breasts, and eventually released and sent back to Britain after a lot of campaigning, including by UK government, which of course was Labour by that time. And she gave really quite awful and horrendous accounts of what she had heard from other women prisoners of what was going on in Chile, and I put some of that in the book. It's too horrendous to repeat, quite honestly, the crimes of the regime there. So that was all the aftermath of the coup. Now, Fernando was one of about 500 political refugees who finished up in Scotland. There were about 2,500 came to Britain altogether. Most of them, or a lot of them, were educated, intellectual people who worked in academia and universities, were professional people. Only a minority were workers, but there were workers that came over, and notably in Scotland, there were 10 miners who were hosted by the National Union of Mine Workers of Fife, given jobs in the pits, and stayed there until the pits were eventually shut. Some went back to Chile. All of them, to my knowledge, took very active roles, as did their families and wives, in the 1984-85 great miners' strike. But they were mostly professionals. And what happened when, and I know more about Glasgow because I come from that side of the country, and I was sort of involved in the 1970s in that. And so I know a bit more about that. And I know that there were about 250 came to the Glasgow area, the west of Scotland. They were all accommodated through councils that were sympathetic, but of course council housing in Scotland, and the council housing that was available then, wasn't always great, and was certainly a big shock to some of these people. I worked as a social worker in the late 1970s in Drumchapel in Glasgow. Worked there for quite a number of years, and a lot of Chileans were taken up there and placed in one particular street, Capewell Avenue. I know it well. Pretty notorious. It was in the hardest of the hard-to-let bits of Drumchapel. So that was quite a culture shock for them. They encountered racism and a lot of hostility from local people. Very unfortunate that. It would have been much better had they been placed in one of the kind of more traditional working class areas of Glasgow, in the East End or something like that, where there were kind of communities where people understood one another and knew each other. It wasn't like that in schemes in Glasgow. These were marginalised communities where people were quite socially isolated and leading quite hard lives themselves. So the presence of these people from another country they knew nothing about wasn't always received well, which was very unfortunate. But there was a tremendous amount of solidarity activity that grew up around the refugees, led by people in the Chile Solidarity Campaign, And in Scotland, there was a Scottish Chile Defence Committee set up soon after the coup. And that kind of coordinated efforts in Glasgow and elsewhere in Scotland, including in Edinburgh, and liaised with councils, local authorities, social services departments, and so on, to try and ensure that people were supported and given the opportunity to learn English. And you can't get much further away. Oh, you know, Spain's not very far away. People speak Spanish there, obviously, but Chile's quite a long way from here. So quite considerable cultural differences and quite a lot of learning on both sides involved in all of that. And then, of course, there was solidarity action. Now, people will have, I'm sure some of you, all of you will have seen Ne Passerán, the movie. Great description of what happened in Rolls Royce, a very moving description of how, within days of the coup, the Shop Stewards Committee there resolved to support the people of Chile and condemn the coup at that time. And I've spoken to some of them, and they had no idea that that was actually involved them, because they were dealing with jet engines, but they never knew where they were from, and they didn't really take much interest in them. Which brings us on to arms sales, because Britain, the Hawker Hunter jet engines that were serviced by Rolls Royce and East Kilbride, that were boycotted at the beginning of 1974, when one of the shop stewards discovered them there. The boycott commenced then and continued for 4 years, which is absolutely incredible. Nothing like that happened anywhere else in the world. And we should feel really proud that that's part of our tradition in Scotland. Now, Britain had Hawker Hunter jets were a major arms sale for the UK. In the 1950s, when they were first produced, they were sold to our closest friends. Britain had made a mistake in the late 40s by selling Rolls Royce jet engines, Nene engines at that time, not the ones that went into the Hunters, to the Soviet Union in 1946-47, arrogantly believing that they could not be copied. Not only did the Soviets copy them, they mass-produced them and stuck them in their MiG-15 fighters, which, when they appeared in Korea in the early 1950s in the war there, they could outperform anything that the Americans or the British had. So Britain learned from that. So when the Hunters, the export licenses were released for the Hunters, that were sold to friendly nations, European nations and so on, that it was on the proviso that when these air forces no longer needed them, they would be sold back to the UK. So by the mid-70s, the mid-60s, a number of them were coming back to Hawker and being sold on. And one of the places where of the 30 or 40 of them finished up was Chile, these refurbished second-hand warplanes that were still lethal. The Chilean armed forces at that time had never been involved in any action. Most South American armies and air forces and navies were used internally. The Chilean Navy, which had lots of British ships, and British ships were being built for the Chilean Navy at the time of the coup. The only time they were ever involved in any action was to shell or blast Popular Unity bases in the port of Valparaiso in September 1973. The only time the Air Force ever saw action was to bomb the Moneda Palace, which saw the death of Allende in September 1973. So we weren't too particular about who we sold arms to, so long as they were either on our side in the Cold War confrontation or could be won to be on our side, particularly the case with third world countries. So we were also, the Rolls Royce action was particularly successful and unknown to the workers at the time, resulted in the grounding of the Chilean Air Force. What happened was that after the coup, presumably using them to bomb their own people, had worn some of them out. So a whole lot of them were taken to Britain for refurbishment. And the engines, of course, finished up. 8 of the engines finished up in the East Kilbride plant, where they were identified and boycotted. 4 of them were released in 1975 after a lot of pressure from the Labour government, which is appalling. Labour had a policy of no further arms sales to Chile after they took power. They were elected to power in February 1974, but they continued other imports and exports on the basis that our own industry couldn't survive without Chilean copper. So we had a kind of quite an ambivalent relationship through our Labour government to Chile. There were also the Rolls Royce action was successful. The submarines, there were 2 submarines on the slipways in Port Glasgow at Scott Lithgow shipyard that were almost finished. And an attempt was made, a concerted attempt was made by Chile Solidarity Campaign nationally to get them boycotted. And for a while, the AUEW, the main engineering union at that time, supported that action and instructed the workers in that shipyard not to work on them. Now, the workers had already boycotted a launch soon after the coup by the wife of the Chilean naval attaché who sided with the coup. She came to Glasgow in, I think, November 73 to launch the boats, and that was boycotted. There was a demonstration outside. Sadly, that wasn't followed up. And when the AUEW asked the workforce there not to complete the submarines, the workforce said, no, we don't want to lose our jobs, because Rolls Royce was awash with work. And they told me that the Chilean engines represented about 1% of the work they were doing. In the shipyard in Greenock, if they'd stopped work, then they would have been paid off. And similarly with the frigates that were nearing completion in Yarrows in Glasgow, there was intermittent sporadic action, but nothing concerted to stop them being sent back to Chile, which is what happened. And similarly with the 2 vessels being refurbished, refitted in Swan Hunter on Tyneside, that yard's gone there. But they were sent to Scotland for stores after they were completed, and the Rosyth workers actually boycotted them for a while. But all these ships finished up back in Chile as an active part of the Chilean Navy. The Air Force engines mysteriously disappeared. They've been sitting outside in the yard at Rolls Royce for years. Now, these are precision bits of machinery. You can't store them outside without absolutely ruining them. And the workers there are convinced that these things were beyond any use, but there was symbolic significance to Chileans. So through court action, they managed to get the government to agree that they could take them back. They did that through a military operation in the middle of the night at East Kilbride in Scotland, not in Chile. So you wonder how they could do that without the complicit involvement of the British Special Forces. And it had to be. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I think, you're not going to do that. So these engines did finish up back in Chile. The film shows, Ne Passerán, that some of them at least actually finished up the junkyard. So whether they were actually usable and ever used again is doubtful. And one of them, of course, is now in East Kilbride as a monument to the struggle of the workers there. So it wasn't all successful. There were some things that happened that quite honestly shouldn't have done. I mean, there's football going on today and people get really worked up about football. And in 1977, everybody in Scotland was getting worked up because it looked as if Scotland was going to be in the World Cup. It was. And one of the games in 1977 that was planned to work up towards that was a series of friendly games in South America, including Argentina, where the World Cup was held, which was a dictatorship as well. Not quite as murderous as the Chilean dictatorship, but not far off it. Nobody said a word about that in 1978. But in 77, A match was planned in the Santiago Stadium, the site of murder and torture. And the Scotland team, a big campaign was launched to name it as the match of shame and to stop that happening. The FTUC and the TUC got involved and tried to persuade the players to boycott the game. They did a ballot of the players in Scotland, and the majority of players said that they would go. The minority said, well, if we don't go, we will never play again for Scotland. So eventually the whole team did go. In England, the players' union didn't even bother with that. They just said, no, we're not doing it. England were involved because a lot of Scottish team players were played for English clubs. That's why that was significant. So the game went ahead. I can't remember if Scotland won or lost. Who gives a fuck, quite honestly? Should never have happened. And it was a mark of shame, a stain on the Scotland football team, highlighted by many people, including at the time leading football journalists, but sadly not enough. Now, I need to finish up now, but I just want to say that we should be proud of the solidarity action that did take place, and we should be proud of that continuing tradition, because it has continued. What happened in Chile, it was in some ways a template for other solidarity action that's happened since. Chile was a high watermark, as was action around boycotting South African goods and the release of Nelson Mandela. Really important things that in Scotland we were very involved in. Glasgow was the first place in the world to give Nelson Mandela the freedom of the city. That kind of tradition's continued. It's continued around refugees. Now, I wish I could say that Scotland's a welcoming country and we don't have the same attitudes as they do in England towards immigrants and refugees. It's actually far more complex than that. And surveys show that that may not actually be the case, that a lot of people that vote Labour and Liberal Democrat and certainly Tory in Scotland don't think that immigrants don't contribute or don't fit in either culturally or economically. Absolute nonsense, but sadly that's a fact, and you can't deny it. Britain was somehow better than people in England, where attitudes are also not as good as they should be. But in 2021, Kenmure Street in Glasgow, there was a Home Office operation to try and remove some asylum seekers and detain them with a view to deporting them back to, I think it was Bangladesh. That was unsuccessful because the community mobilised. There had been plans in place that if anything like that happened, word got around, everybody would just arrive at that area at the one time. And that's what happened. The Home Office and the police were totally paralysed and eventually had to back down. And the two men were released. We've seen other things like that. The one that's important to me, because Rosa Sala did a wee brief forward for the book and is helping with the launch event in Glasgow in a few weeks' time. It was the Glasgow girls. She was at school then in Drumchapel, back to Drumchapel again, Drumchapel High School, where she and some of her friends mobilised national and international opinion to stop the deportation of one of their friends and their family. Action that again was successful. They were 15 years old at that time, but they managed to change national opinion because they were prepared to do something about it. So these are all fantastic acts of solidarity. We should look back on Chile as pride. Now, 50 years ago was a horrible thing. The fascist coup was nothing to celebrate. But the 50 years of solidarity that we've seen since certainly are. And with that, I'll end and I'll take any questions.
Yeah, we've got about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. If anyone has one now, you can raise your hand, or I can kick off with one if everyone wants a minute to think. I'll start with, oh, did you have a question? No, I'll start with one. You touched on it a little bit. Also, could you just repeat the question after I say it for the live stream into the microphone? you talked a little bit about the end about the reception of refugees at the time. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit in comparison as to what you see in your analysis, the reception of refugees 50 years ago to kind of the hostile environment policies and things like that today, how that solidarity has changed, or has it stayed the same kind of?
Yeah, the question was about how we welcome refugees today in comparison with how we did 50 years ago. And I didn't come along to talk with having researched that.
Sure.
So what I can tell you is that the legal system is completely different now, the immigration system to what it was then. But the whole question was just as controversial at that time. As it certainly is today. It was just as much weaponized by right-wing politicians in order to foment or foment distraction in the form of looking down on refugees as being the cause of our economic woes and problems. And they were as abundant then in the early 1970s. I'm talking about economic dislocation and hardship and poverty, as abundant then as they are with today's cost of living crisis. And then, just as now, refugees and asylum seekers are an easy target. Quite honestly, we should have learned through the Brexit debacle that if you stop people's ability to come to the country, you soon finish up with problems in all sorts of areas of the economy. We don't seem to have learned that. And quite honestly, Suella Braverman and her predecessor, their actions are well, to tell you this, they are shockingly disgusting in the scapegoating and the use of that. When the barge will take a tiny proportion. The barge in Portland had 39 people on it when they had to be evacuated after 3 days because of Legionella in the water supply. 39 people during that time, the 3 days it was operating, hundreds and hundreds of people continued to seek refuge in Britain from horrendous situations that they're trying to get away from, whether caused through war or climate change or whatever. And that continues. Now, the Chilean experience is different from that because it was to do with political change, as it often is today. I mean, Afghans today have every right to want to seek a better future. Watching a thing last night about the way women are treated now in Afghanistan, which is worse than ever. And so can you blame people for wanting to seek refuge in a country who were apparently supporting them militarily until they decided it wasn't worth a shot and suddenly pulled out and left them all high and dry? We owe them something, just as we owe, and we have a better understanding now of what slavery and colonization did to countries that we were associated from the UK with in the past. And we owe it to the people of these countries to have an open border and a welcome to them, given the serious situations facing a lot of these countries that we exploited to the hill and in some cases enslaved. So the Chileans were slightly different. There were economic links and military links between Britain and Chile going back a long, long way. But nobody that came here from Chile came here because they had an association with the UK, not to my knowledge. But we were all strangers to one another when they arrived, but they were nonetheless, I think, given a fantastic welcome by certainly people around the left. I think the rest of the country is probably quite indifferent to their plight or their circumstances. But certainly on the left, there was a tremendous mobilisation of support for them. In Edinburgh and in Glasgow and elsewhere, a lot of the big towns in Scotland.
Right. Any questions from the audience? Yeah, we can either one and then the other one.
Yeah, well, I don't know very much about this because my focus was on things that happened during the time of the dictatorship. But my understanding is that Chile has continued to move towards increasing their democracy, and that in the elections in 2019, the whatever the Socialist Party is called now, because it's not called that anymore, but a kind of green socialist movement took power. And Chile's constitution is different from ours. So you have there are elections that overlap each other, a bit like in the USA. So the right control one assembly or whatever, and the left controlled the other. So it was a confused situation. But the left government were committed to a new constitution that would include green reforms, reforms that suited the indigenous people, the Mapuchos particularly, who had lost ground a lot, certainly during the time of the dictatorship, and they hadn't regained much since. And made tremendous progress during Allende's time. So the constitution, there's been a lot of political controversy and argument around it, with people on the right opposing the constitutional change and sadly successfully mobilizing the population sufficiently to vote against it in a referendum, I think last year, 2022. So that has set things back in Chile. But I'm not aware that the military are lurking in the background. I think that hopefully has been consigned to the past in Chile. I think it's been consigned to the past in the UK because there isn't really much military left anymore, is there? And if they mounted the coup, I'm not sure it would be very noticeable. Maybe I'm being a bit naive. They're probably still quite powerful. But yeah.
You said that there was a coup during November. By many people in Chile as a feeler by the military. Be happy to find out. Then the general came out and argued for it. Oh, I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't really. And it's not court. Like if you're referring to.
Yeah, the question is about the Tancuso rebellion in June 1973, shortly before the November coup, where some units of the army moved in on the seats of government in Santiago and were opposed by other military formations, and it all evaporated quite quickly. Now, after that, things moved significantly after that. You're absolutely right. It possibly was used as a feeler. I think one of the generals who sided with Allende was murdered. I think I can't remember. Was that Pratt? Yeah. Yeah. And at the time of the coup itself, the junta was composed of 4 military leaders: the Air Force, the Navy, and 2 from the army. Now Pinochet was one of them, and Pinochet only joined them at the last minute, either the day of the coup or the day before the coup, when it was a fait accompli. He was certainly opposed to Allende, but was hedging his bets until the last minute about whether the time was actually right. But when the military moved, although everybody had been expecting it, apparently, that's what I'm told, by Chileans who were very involved at that time, that they'd expected it. But nonetheless, it seems to have taken them by surprise and completely disarmed them.
You go to your first part.
Yeah, that's right. That's what's been said here is that people were almost set up. They'd been told to go to places to mobilise. Yeah, that's right. And being told that they would be issued with arms to defend the popular unity, and that didn't happen. The military got there first, and that's how Jara was picked up. Jara went to defend the university as soon as the coup was announced. Managed to smuggle a note out of the stadium where he was detained, telling his wife where the car was parked. And, you know, people were surprised. And then what happened was the military moved in. Their biggest fear was there'd be a working class rebellion. So most of their focus was on the working class areas of Santiago and the other cities where they didn't take prisoners, literally. That's where most of the murders took place. And people simply disappeared. That was what the DINA was established for. So that left the resistance in the hands really of middle class popular unity supporters. The mere leadership were all murdered. Yeah, and it's a very interesting study, isn't it? That if you and that's, I suppose, where I started on this. I thought it was important to highlight what happened with Corbyn and the way Corbyn was undermined. And there's a talk in a few days' time here with Michael Chesham where he'll be talking about that. And you know, and I think I won't be able to come to that, but I'd love to, because I think there are parallels and lessons not learned from what happened in Chile. That's why history is so important. And I can see a few of us here today who were adults 50 years ago, and a lot of people that weren't, but we need to remember these histories because they're so important. Kathy, yeah.
Commemorate 50 years on the church. It's really called the University of Edinburgh, and you can find it on Eventbrite, but it's going to be Chile and music place.
What's going to happen is not an unfortunately none of the events have actually put together maybe for Chile 50 years Scotland and yeah lots of events. Yeah, the Chile 50 website. If you that's attention's being drawn to that. I don't think the Edinburgh events on it. Oh, all right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. The STUC are doing something in Glasgow as well. There's my own book launch event in City Chambers on the 4th, and yeah, and there are a number of events taking place throughout the world. Should be able to book the event right, but it's actually advertised on event. That's yeah. Okay. So thank you all very much for coming along. And that was...
We have the we have the sustainable fund shop, and then you want to carry on chatting or anyone wants that, but try and buy Colin, you can move into that room so we can get this room back together. Yeah, thank you so much.